and probably very significant in the way in which it moves the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church away from being an Oxford Dictionary of the Church of England through which one sees the rest of the Christian Church to being a dictionary of the Christian Church. Is that a fair, very brief summary of significant change?
Globalization was the word.
Globalization and Byzantine theology meeting. I had the great blessing of having Professor Andrew is my supervisor of my PhD thesis at the University of Durham. I know all too well how fortunate we are to have him here speaking to us today on Jonathan Bouverie. He's also written some of his older books, still very interesting books. Recently republished his Origins of the Christian Mystical Tradition and Discerning the Mystery, a wonderful study of the significance, you could say the significance of the holding together of theology and spirituality in the Christian life and the contemporary significance of patristic or allegorical reading of both Scripture and the world. Father Andrew, we're very grateful that you've come today. Looking forward to your talk, and I hope to you'll be willing to take discussions or questions and discussion at the end. Thank you.
George, Father, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. What I've called it, this is about John of Damascus, but it's really called John of Damascus, a theologian and his influences, because the second half of the lecture is going to be explicitly on the influence he had on later theologians. But even in the first part, I'm going to angle it towards what comes later. But I will have a first part in which I'll tell you something about John of Damascus himself. It could be claimed that St. John of Damascus is to be numbered among theologians whose influence on succeeding generations has been most diverse. Indeed, perhaps he stands out for the range of his influence. That at least is the claim that I intend to advance in this lecture. But before we talk about his influence, I need to say something about who he was, for although his name is familiar to anyone with an interest in Christian theology, often enough that is as far as any knowledge of him goes. John Damascene was born in the last half of the 7th century AD, and probably towards the beginning of that period, so between about 650 and 675. But we don't know. He was born in Damascus and was known there as in Damascus as Johanna ibn Sajun ibn Mansur. That is John, the son of Sajun, or Sergius, as it was they represented it in Greek, the son of Mansur. He was therefore born in the capital of the recently established Arab Umayyad Empire, the fruits of the conquest of a large swathe of territory from North Africa across to the Hindu Kush that had hitherto constituted the eastern and southern provinces of the Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, and the whole of the Persian Sassanid Empire. A cultural and a political revolution that was to change that part of the world, the Near or Middle East, forever. About John Damascene's family, we do at least know something. His grandfather, in particular, known as Mansur ibn Sajun, crops up in the chronicles of the period in a very striking way. According to the Arabic annals of the 9th, 10th century Melkite Christian historian Evtychios of Alexandria, Melkite I'm using in the sense in which historians use it in this period, in other words, Christians outside the empire who accepted the theology of the empire. They were called Melkites after the emperor. Melkite means belonging to the king, belonging to the Vasilevs, belonging to the emperor. And they were only one of the Christian groups within the Umayyad Empire. But according to the Evtychios, the Damascene's grandfather had had a colourful career. He'd been appointed a tax official in Damascus by the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, who died in 602, during the Persian occupation from 614 to 628. Mansur had handed over the taxes he had collected to the occupying Persian authorities. When the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius arrived in Jerusalem, having driven out the Persians. In 630, he went on to Damascus and demanded restitution of these tax receipts from Mansur, with blows and imprisonment, as Eutychius puts it, in return for confirming Mansur in his office, leaving him angry at heart against Heraclius. An anger which finally manifested itself in his surrendering Damascus to the Arabs, an event that set the seal of the Byzantine loss of Syria to the Arab conquerors, prompting Heraclius' famous farewell to Syria. Mansur ibn Sajun seems to have been confirmed in his position as fiscal officer of the region, but his son, Sajun ibn Mansur, is said to have served as secretary, katib, and an important official in the court of the Caliph, appointed presumably by Caliph Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, and continuing into the reign of Abd al-Malik, who died in 705. His son, Yohanna, John, seems to have succeeded his father in the fiscal administration of the Umayyad Empire. Now one can well imagine, and this is important for what follows, one can well imagine that in Byzantine circles, the family name Mansur evoked some very bitter memories, given that John's grandfather had betrayed the city of Damascus first to the Persians and then irrevocably to the Arabs. The Mansur family seems from their name to have been of Aramean or even Arab stock. Eutychius in his chronicles counts the Mansur family as a local family, distinguishing them from those he calls al-Rum, the Romans, that is the Byzantines. And as Sidney Griffith has put it, clearly the Mansurs were an indigenous family whose members enjoyed a high civil status both under Roman rule and under the Umayyads. Their knowledge of Greek is no indication of Greek ancestry, but rather a testimony to the success of the promotion of Hellenic culture by the Roman emperors from Severus onwards in Damascus, the metropolis of their newly declared Roman colony, Syria. Damascus was, as Cyril Mango observed long ago, a better place than most to get a good Greek education in the 7th century, from which John benefited. It seems likely that John left Damascus for Jerusalem around 705, for from that year, with the accession to the Caliphate of Al-Walid, the hitherto tolerant attitude toward Christians began to worsen, as well as changing the language of administration from Greek to Arabic. The early Umayyads had simply adopted the administrative arrangements of the regions they had conquered. Caliph al-Walid marked the beginning of his reign by constructing an the Umayyad mosque, as it's now called, on the site of the Christian church of St. John the Baptist in Damascus, thus making more visible the political reality of Islam. Having served the Caliphate, and having come from a prominent and presumably wealthy family, John arrived in Jerusalem a man of means, whose intention in Jerusalem was to embrace a life of prayer and scholarship. Tradition had it that John became a monk of the Marsava monastery in the Judean desert, but recently this long-held belief has been abandoned by scholars for largely negative reasons. There is no evidence whatever of his association with the Marsava monastery for several centuries, though there is slight evidence to associate him with the so-called Spudei, the studious monks of the Church of the Anastasis, called in the West the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in Jerusalem. And there he lived as a monk and devoted himself to philosophical and theological endeavours, as well as writing religious poetry and hymnody in Greek for the developing liturgical services of the monasteries in and around Jerusalem. For Greek was to remain the language of worship in that region for decades, if not centuries. The transition to the use of Palestinian Aramaic and thence Arabic in Jerusalem in Christian worship not getting underway until some time after John's death. While it is possible that some of John's literary output was composed in Damascus while still a layman, it seems that most of it belongs to his time in Jerusalem. John himself speaks of the closeness that existed between himself and Patriarch John V of Jerusalem, a rare bit of biographical information one can glean from his own writings. And it seems likely that up to the death of the Patriarch in 735, John had a privileged position in Jerusalem. His wealth may well have played a part in his friendship with John V, for the Patriarch was in need of resources of wealth, such as John's, to keep pace with the increasingly visible presence of Islam in the Holy City. The construction of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque most likely took place during the Patriarchate of John V. Patriarch John must have had his work cut out, for his election as Patriarch came after a long period in which the Jerusalem Patriarch had been vacant. That is, since the death of Patriarch Sophronius, shortly after he had surrendered the Holy City to Caliph Umar in 638. So over a period of nearly 70 years, there had been no Patriarch. John Damascene's works fall into several categories: polemical works against Christian heresies, works of logic intended to enable Orthodox Christians to argue for and defend their beliefs. Since Chalcedon, or even really since Nicaea, with its introduction of the term homoousios, Christian belief was expressed in increasingly philosophical terms. A famous summary account of the beliefs of the theology of the Byzantine Imperial Church, called On the Orthodox Faith, or in Greek, an exact exposition of the faith. And then liturgical works, both homilies. He was a noted preacher, given the epithet chrysoroas, flowing with gold, which is a kind of variant of the epithet Chrysostomos that was given to St. John Chrysostom. Chrysostomos meaning golden mouth. And also liturgical verse or hymnody. And it is indeed most truly in this liturgical verse that accompanied developments of the monastic office in the Byzantine Church that he has had his greatest influence. For the doctrines of the faith now found their way most effectively into the hearts of the believers when put into song. His works against Christian heresies were directed mainly against those who rejected one or more of the councils at which imperial orthodoxy had been defined and refined. There were those who rejected the third of these ecumenical councils held at Ephesus in 431. They had suffered exile from the Byzantine Empire and called themselves the Church of the East, though called by their opponents Nestorians. Within the Umayyad Empire, which had extended its territories into the former Persian Empire, they were now a presence alongside the Orthodox Church of the imperial councils. And by the time the Damascene had begun to spread the faith eastward, reaching China only a few decades after the Damascene's death, as witnessed by the Xi'an stele, which is to be dated to 781, which gives an account of these Christian missionaries from Syria who had reached China, an account in the stele given both in Chinese with a translation in Syriac accompanying it. There were too those who rejected the fourth ecumenical council, that of Chalcedon, seeing in its Christological definition a betrayal of St. Cyril of Alexandria, whose authority had been unassailable at that council. These were called by their enemies Monophysites, by modern scholars by the barbarous Greek construct Miaphysite. And then there were those called Monothelites, who accepted only one divine will in Christ and were condemned by the Sixth Ecumenical Council of Constantinople II in 680-81. John's polemical writings also rebutted the Manichees, now again a presence in the Umayyad Empire, which covered the old Persia. And finally, there were two heresies closer to his own time, Islam, which John ranked as the 100th and last heresy, the preparation for Antichrist, and somewhat later, exclamation mark, the iconoclasm, which John refuted in 3 treatises, or perhaps better, 3 editions of a single treatise. So most of these works, as I said, were written during John's time in Jerusalem, and the bulk of them likely while Patriarch John V was still alive. After the Patriarch's death, John's star may have declined. And so keeping these modal verbs, there are other scholars who will have indicative verbs here, but the evidence in fact is very slight, though it inclines this way rather than anything else. After the Patriarch's death, John's star may have declined. If so, maybe owing to his hostility towards both the Byzantine Emperor Constantine V and the Caliph Walid over the question of images. And he may have retired from Jerusalem to devote himself to the editing and refining of his works. And the fruits of that may have included a 3-fold work called The Fount of Knowledge, which was a composite work of 3 parts. The first part being a revised version of his Dialectica, his logic textbook. The second part being the work on the heresies, ending with Islam. And the third part being on the Orthodox faith. I'll come to it later, but there is a letter that he wrote, which probably in 743, which suggests that the Fount of Knowledge consists of these 3 works. And perhaps too, during this period of his of retreat and retirement, during this period he may have written his final considered rejection of the iconoclasts, his 3rd treatise on the divine images. In what constituted the legacy of St. John Damascene? If he had an influence, how can we trace the signs of this influence? And this, I think, can be seen both in form and in content, and I wouldn't want to set one against the other. I think they're both equally important in their own way. Let's take form first. Studies of the Damascene were transformed in the last century by the Byzantine Institute of the Benedictine Abbey of Cheyenne, which devoted much of its scholarly energies to the Damascene, to studies of the Damascene, at the heart of which was a critical edition prepared by Don Bonifacius Cotta, a monk of that monastery, the 5th volume of which was published in 1988, the year after his death, and included most of the works of the Damascene that can be regarded as authentic. This edition revealed John's fondness for the genre of the century, a work consisting of 100 chapters. The exposition of the Orthodox faith was revealed to be just such a century, something that had been disguised by its division in manuscripts of the Latin tradition into 4 books to match the 4 books of Peter Lombard's sentences, of which more later, which is the form in which it has come to be known in all printed editions until Cotta's edition, from Lequion's major edition of John of Damascus in the 18th century onwards. So too, the Treatise of Heresies in its original form had been a century, the last chapter, the 100th chapter, being on Islam. While the textbook of logic, generally referred to as the Dialectica, was shown to exist in 2 forms that had been disguised by printed editions, an earlier edition of 50 chapters, a kind of half-century, which had hitherto been embedded in an incomplete 2nd edition running to 68 chapters. John had most likely, John had evidently died before finishing his revision, because the revised Dialectic is incomplete, and he may have intended expanding the 50th chapter of the Dialectic into a century, but that's a guess. Now, the century was a monastic genre, introduced by Evagrius, monk of the Egyptian desert who died in 399. He used it in a skillful way for some of his centuries, contained only 90 chapters, for instance, the 5 chapters, the 5 centuries of the Kephalia Gnostica, or, for instance, a work called The Monk, completing the analytic first 90 chapters with 10 chapters drawn from the saying of the Blessed Fathers. Either way, suggesting that the completeness represented by the century was in some ways inappropriate for expositions of the Christian monastic life. Or another way of putting it, that completeness was found not in further analysis, but rather in the practical life and practical examples, as contained in the sayings, pointed out the necessity of completing whatever thought was involved with the actual practice of what we've been thinking about. Later centuries generally confined later works in the form of a century, generally confined themselves to monastic or mystical wisdom. For instance, the Philokalia is full of these centuries. Though Sir Maximus the Confessor and a few others use the genre of the century to expound philosophical, theological matters. For instance, Maximus's 2 centuries on theology and the economy. In using the genre of the century, John was placing himself in a monastic context. Alongside the century, you also find treatises of a kind of expanded century of 150 chapters, matching the number of the Psalms. Both these genres presented their subject in the form of chapters for meditation, rather than in the form of a treatise arranged more geometrical, where there are progression throughout and arguments and so on. In his retirement, John seems to have considered prefacing 2 of these rediscovered centuries on heresies and the exposition of the faith with a revised version of the Dialectica, maybe also in the form of a century, to form a 3-fold treatise called Pigignosios, the Fount of Knowledge. The evidence for this is a letter addressed to the most venerable and divinely honoured Cosmas, Bishop of Mayuma, that prefaces the Dialectica, presenting it as the first part of a 3-part Fount of Knowledge. Only one manuscript in the tradition presents the Fount of Knowledge in this form, and it is late and is clearly, in fact, confected on the basis of John's letter. Some monk sort of reading the letter decided, well, we will put it together in that form, Dialectica on heresies and on the Orthodox faith. Nevertheless, the letter certainly suggests that the nature of the Damascene's final plan for these works. The manuscript tradition itself suggests that the commonest way in which the exposition of the faith was presented is together with and following the 50th century Dialectica, the 2 treatises together forming a treatise of 150 chapters, often called 150 philosophical and theological chapters. And this may have been the form in which the Damascene originally conceived it. It was certainly the form in which it was read in the centuries after their composition. And for instance, in the course of the Hesychast controversy, Gregory Palamas summed up the position of the Orthodox in terms of a similar work of 150 chapters, called 150 philosophical and theological chapters. Another form that John Damascus made his own, though we don't know whether he created it or not, was the form of the canon. That is the canon that forms the backbone still of the Orthodox service of Orthros or Matins, the dawn office. During John's lifetime, the monastic office was enriched by this genre of liturgical poetry known as the canon. The backbone of monastic matins, or orthros, up to this date, had consisted of the recitation of the odes or canticles of the Old Testament, plus 2 New Testament canticles that we know, these Anglicans know, the West knows, as the Magnificat and the Benedictus. The canon was a series of liturgical verses that were intended to be inserted into the final verses of the Ode. The earliest writers of such canons were Cosmas of Mayuma, we already met, Bishop of Mayuma, to whom John of Damascus wrote the dedicatory letter to his last work, Andrew of Crete, and John of Damascus, all of whom are associated both with Damascus and also with Jerusalem. Andrew of Crete's great canon, a kind of ransacking of the Bible for examples of repentance, came to form the centerpiece of the 5th week of Lent, and I don't know how far the practice goes back, is read divided into 4 chunks during the 1st week of Lent. While John Damascene's Paschal canon is probably the best known of all the canons. The canon owes something to the earlier Kontakion, which formed part of the so-called cathedral office, but instead of being a first sermon, it is more a series of meditations in verse. And much work still needs to be done in establishing accurate texts of these canons as well as assigning them to their authors. But it seems generally accepted that John played a major role in the writing of canons, which remain part of the Orthodox service Orthros. And within a few centuries of John's death, he was certainly regarded as the most important liturgical poet in the Byzantine tradition. So much for form. What about content? How much is distinctive in the works of the Damascene, given his declaration that I shall say nothing of my own, having rather gathered together into one the fruits of the most highly regarded teachers? So that, as the late Lionel Wickham once memorably put it, patristic theology may be said to aspire to the condition of the Florilegium, collection of extracts from authorities, and its last representative, John of Damascus, whose orthodoxa fide is a mosaic of quotations, attains its goal. Now let us confine ourselves to the first and last components of the Fountain of Knowledge, plus the treatise against the iconoclasts, and see what in these can be regarded in some ways as original to John, and therefore marks, if you like, of his influence. First of all, the dialectica. It is certainly the case that the dialectic in either of its forms stands in a tradition of summaries of Aristotelian logic, at the source of which is Porphyry's Isagogy, and belongs to a genre of Christian logic textbooks, about which Mosman Rouchet has written so illuminatingly. But the material from which the Damascene borrowed has not been put together without careful thought. It is not just a compilation. These Christian textbooks of logic reveal their Christian character, not just in giving examples with names such as Peter and Paul rather than Socrates, but in a much deeper way. Now, because of time, I think I'm going to just summarize the next page. There are various ways in which scholars have seen this deeper significance. What is clear about either version of the Dialectica, they are concerned to identify, to make clear, terms such as ousia, being, physis, nature, prosopon, person or face, and then terms rather complex terms such as inipostatos and anipostatos. And these are terms that have become fundamental aspects of the defense of Chalcedon from about the 6th century onwards. Sorry, 6th century onwards. The 6th century theologians, people like, particularly Leontis of Byzantium, had introduced a rather philosophically wrought way of presenting Chalcedon in such a way as to meet the objections mostly of the Monophysites, particularly of Severus of Antioch, who is certainly the greatest theologian period after Chalcedon. And it's also striking, I think, that the early form of the Dialectica, the one of 50 chapters, has a final chapter which is on the hypostatic union, peritis kathypostatin in nosios. Now, various scholars have presented various arguments